Last class, we talked about how the Articles of Confederation, basically the first form of government that the United States had, was a good start, but it just didn't quite make it where we needed it to go. So what happens? Well, recognizing the various issues that exist, they come up with this idea of having a constitutional convention. And the idea at first is we're just going to fix the problems that exist. We're not really worried about all of the various things that we could improve. We're just going to make a couple of small changes to make it better. If you remember last class, we identified one area we thought we would improve if we were the Constitutional Convention, and that was to basically give the commerce power to the federal government. And that would certainly be a good start. But shortly after the Constitutional Convention convened, delegates began to realize this is a much bigger problem than simply fixing a couple of problems, putting a couple of Band-Aids on. It was going to require a lot more work. So by the end of this class, once we've walked through everything, here's the 3 things that I want you guys to be able to do. I want you to be able to compare the competing approaches to representation and national power, explain how legislative and executive authority was structured, and evaluate compromises as both a design tool and a source of enduring injustice. So let's jump in with the first problem that exists. Talked about that. There were 2 plans that came to be with respect to how we were going to do representation. And these are known as the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. We talked about this a little bit last class. The Virginia Plan had representation tied more closely to population. This had stronger national institutions and favored by larger states, where the New Jersey Plan was equal state voting. It retained the Confederation logic that was already applied, and it was favored by smaller states. Now, just as it kind of is today, the states were divided up kind of by their population in kind of a north-south sort of area. In the southern states, we had things like a lot of farming and stuff like that that required big open spaces. And so the need for large populations was diminished. In the north, we had more manufacturing stuff, and therefore, in the north, you needed more people. So they had much larger populations. Now, if you are someone down in the south, you want your interests to be powerful, right? You are one of the 13 equal players in this. You think that you ought to have 1/13 of the vote. Sound fair? If you're in the north, that sounds okay, except for you have maybe 3 times the population as Georgia. And so you think to yourself, well, if I have 3 times the population of Georgia, I should have 3 times the vote. Does that sound fair to people? What do you guys think the more fair solution is? And why?
I would say give it to both states, like give equal amount of votes for both states. That way, you will have equal people have equal votes.
So do it based on population, right?
Yeah, just like for example, if Columbia and my hometown Sykeston, which is down south, was pretty much wanted to have votes, a voting rights or have Congress rights, each state will cast a vote and basically have equal amount of votes.
Okay, so you're saying each state would have the same number of votes.
Yes.
Okay. Anybody have a different thought? Anybody want to make the argument for proportional representation? Anybody before we start calling on people? All right, I'll make the argument for proportional representation, but next class I'll bring in index cards so we can play that game too. All right, so the argument for proportional representation is that our concept of democracy is that each person gets a vote. If you want equal representation, then to get equal representation, each person's vote needs to count. But if we say that New York, New Jersey, Georgia, everybody only gets one vote, then a lot of people's votes don't count, right? So what's the solution? How do we fix this? How do we make it so that this is fair for everybody? What'd you say? Exactly. And this is called the Great Compromise. It uses both principles. With the Great Compromise, you have the House that is based on population, and you have the Senate that's based on the state. So each state gets 2 senators, and each state gets a certain number of representatives based on their population. The smallest is Rhode Island, the largest is California, and that's going to be entirely based on, you know, how many people are actually there. So what's the problem with this? What becomes the issue? Yeah? Other issues? Yeah? One of the biggest problems with this is that we still kind of have the same problem, because the way we've set it up is that you have this proportional representation, but in order to make it work, we're going to say that you have to have both chambers agree. So it makes it a little bit more difficult to get anything done. If you guys had to make sure everybody in your group was happy before you went out to dinner, how many times would you actually get to go out to dinner? Yeah, it'd be really hard. Let me try one more thing. I think I have one last solution in this bag before I give up on it forever. Nope, we're not even going to waste the time on that. So the idea of this Great Compromise helps a little bit, but it still makes things a little bit difficult because it doesn't solve all the problems. It creates the injustices we have today. Because one of the other things we did is we tied how we elect the president to that quasi-proportional, quasi-equal representation. How many electoral votes does Rhode Island have? Well, it's going to be equal to the number of representatives they have. So each state has so many representatives to the Electoral College. We'll get into this in more detail. Short answer, you guys don't elect the President of the United States. Instead, the way this works is that you elect the electors, basically, that elect the President of the United States. So when you cast your vote for president, what happens after that is that electors are sent to Washington, D.C., and they are going to cast their ballot for whoever the state tells them to cast the ballot for. This becomes an issue then because there are some states that are completely meaningless. Rhode Island, nobody really ever campaigns there because they don't have very many electors. When it's time for the next presidential election, you're going to hear all about all the things happening in California, though, because they have tons of electors. Same with Texas, same with Florida. So it makes the politicians focus on areas that kind of control the outcome. Missouri, for example, it really doesn't matter what direction we go because we've only got 8 electoral votes. So it creates some inequalities, some injustices, but it is a good compromise between the two plans. It also changes the way that legislation has to be made. Instead of one group of people just simply agreeing that this is the way it's going to be, they have to work together to actually get it done. So next, national authority is going to gain practical tools based on this. Congress could levy taxes and regulate interstate and foreign commerce. We talked about the importance of that. We are not yet at the income tax, okay? Right now, the taxes are more on the state or on certain things, so tariffs and things like that. We haven't yet gotten to a point where the federal government could directly tax the American people. It was indirect taxing the states, then the states would tax you. But this is a massive development that all of a sudden the federal government can get the money they need to pay for the things that they need. Similarly, Commerce Clause. I told you this, and I will keep telling you this. It is one of the most powerful parts of the entire Constitution. Because we went from a system where every colony could kind of do whatever they wanted in terms of commerce to a system where Congress could make things standard. Could you imagine if you bought a pound of flour in Missouri and a pound of flour was, I know this is a ridiculous comparison because ounces define flour and stuff like that, but could you imagine if a pound of flour in Missouri was 10 ounces and a pound of flour in Illinois was 16 ounces? That's part of commerce. That knowing that you're going to get the same thing at the same place, knowing standardized pricing, things like that are things that Congress can regulate. In the United States, a pound is a pound. It's not as awesome as the metric system. If you haven't been converted, if you're majoring in some sort of science field, you will be at some point. Metric system's pretty awesome because a milliliter of water is the same as a gram or a cubic centimeter. So there's all these different measures that make things line up in a lot more interesting way. But the United States Congress has the power to change that sort of stuff. And then finally, with the Commerce Clause, we have the Dormant Commerce Clause. And again, we'll get into a lot more detail about the Dormant Commerce Clause later on. But if Congress has the ability to regulate commerce, what does that mean the states don't have the ability to do? Yeah, to regulate commerce. So we get to a point where, all right, the federal government can do this, and the states can't put limits on it. They can't make things that are more difficult on people because they live in a different state, for example. And then foreign commerce is a big thing. Instead of having Massachusetts go out and say, all right, we're going to borrow a whole bunch of money from Germany, and we're going to buy avocados from Mexico, the United States now has the ability to negotiate those big foreign contracts and stuff like that. It's a big thing because, could you imagine if you come home, how many people have a significant other, boyfriend, girlfriend? Say yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Perfect. How many people would like it if you came home and your significant other said today, hey, guess what? I got us a house. It only cost $120,000. I think we can pay for it, and we're moving next week. Would this be a good thing or a bad thing?
It'd be bad if you had a kind of plan.
Yeah, it could be good. It could be terrible. One way or another, you might want to have some input in that. So this is the kind of thing that was possible under the Articles of Confederation, where one partner to this agreement could just kind of go do their own thing. And now we're saying no, when it comes to interacting in the big wide world, that's the job of the federal government. When constitutionally valid, federal laws and authority became the supreme law of the land. It's called the Supremacy Clause. Again, it's in there. Fascinating because, again, this is something that just a couple years ago, the colonists would have thought was a big problem. But what happens when you start letting states make laws that trump the federal government? There has to be some sort of order to things where everybody knows where people sit. AJ was very mad at me last night. I told him if he wanted to have dessert, he had to eat all of his dinner. He said, why? Because he's 7. I said, because you need nutrition. But why? Because we want you to grow to be big and strong. Why? Because we're interested in how your outcomes. Okay, well, I don't like that rule. I don't want to do that. Well, that's too bad. At some point, the parents have to say, no, you don't have autonomy over this, right? Kind of like the same thing with a 7-year-old. If I were to let him make the rules, then we would have absurd results. Because there could be some rules that apply to him and some rules for my daughter and some rules for my other son. And it's just so with the states. Could you imagine if you had a right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures in Missouri, but in Illinois they did whatever they wanted? That doesn't make sense. And so when it comes to constitutionally valid laws of the United States, they are the supreme law of the land. Next, a national executive would carry out the laws of the land. Remember, a big limitation of the Articles of Confederation was that when Congress wasn't in session, there was nobody to do stuff. Or when we passed laws, we were just kind of hoping everybody would be like, okay, there's a law now. We're going to do that on our honor, right? Now we have an executive. In the beginning, it was just the president. Pretty quickly, it was the president and his cabinet. So there were various people that then could go out and do things as well, like the Secretary of War or the Secretary of the Interior. And they began to develop their own branches of government underneath the executive branch. Now, the Department of Defense, as it's named by statute, Trump has tried to change the name to the Department of War under an executive order. We'll talk all about executive orders later on in the semester. But for now, I'll use Department of War. I'll use Department of Defense because that's what the actual law says it is. So the Department of Defense is gigantic. That contains all of our branches of military. The Pentagon has more people in it than the government would have ever had beginning in our country. But all these things are designed so that Congress doesn't have to make every single decision. Who are my people who work in restaurants? Yeah, fast food counts. Where do you work? Culver's. My family loves Culver's. What do you do at Culver's? Everything up front. Could you imagine if you didn't just do everything up front, but you had to do everything in the entire restaurant all the time? Yeah. There has to be the ability to delegate if we want things to get done. Somebody has to be responsible for going out and cleaning out off tables and grilling food in the back and making sure that things are stocked and taking out the trash. And all these different jobs are things that if we want something to run smoothly, we have to do. And to do that, we have to divide it up among the various branches of government because one thing can't do everything. And then finally, a federal judiciary would decide cases under the Constitution and federal law. But those are the main goals. There are some really hard questions that come up. For example, executive design raised hard questions like, should we have one executive or several executives? Should we have direct election, legislative selection, or another method? If you're in Great Britain, they have a parliamentary system. They have a monarchy with a parliament. The way this works is that parliament exists, and there are various ministers of parliament that are elected that we can kind of think of as our representatives. And they have a House of Lords, and these are more hereditary titles. I think they're getting rid of that for the most part. They're appointed maybe. This can kind of be thought of as our Senate. And the way that works is those two chambers make laws. But the president of Great Britain, the person who acts as the executive, is the prime minister. The prime minister is elected from Parliament. And then Parliament and the House of Lords and everything like this is acting in the name of the monarch, in this case, in the name of the king. So it's the king's power that he has delegated to these people that then do things in his name. Really interesting thing, if you go to law school, our laws are based on the British system. If you've ever heard the term common law, that is a series of various decisions dating back to like the 1400s-ish. And that kind of forms the backbone of our legal system. In fact, if you've ever heard of the right to a trial by a jury of your peers, people think that's a uniquely American thing. Not so. That came from the Magna Carta that was signed in Great Britain about a century before the United States became a thing. The point here is if you ever go to law school, you're going to read cases dealing with common law, and it's always R versus so-and-so. So like R versus Andrew Sartorius. Why is this? Well, every case in Great Britain is brought in the name of the king or the name of the queen. R stands for Rex, for king, or Regina, for queen. We go down this rabbit hole because their system is very different than our system. For them to have a prime minister, first, everybody gets elected to the House of Commons, or to Parliament. And then coalitions form within that house, and they pick one of themselves to be the prime minister, to be the executive. And that's one way of doing it. Should we have an executive that Congress gets to pick? Well, we don't really like that because the interests of the country might be very different than the interests of the state. We don't want to do it that way, right? Well, what if we do it another way? Some people said that the president should serve for life. This would get rid of any sort of political power that we had to worry about. Is that a good idea? No. And again, the fear with that was that it's too close to a monarch. This gets to point 3, how long a term and could the executive serve again? In the beginning, the term was 4 years. It's still 4 years, but there was no concrete limit on how long a president could serve. We have since changed that by a constitutional amendment, and so now the term is a limit of 2 terms. 4, what checks should other institutions possess? So the president, one last presidential format I wanted to talk about. In Rome, when the Senate wasn't in session, they needed people to make decisions as well. So ancient Rome had the concept of co-councils. And the Senate, when they were going out of session, would pick 2 people to serve as councils. And these 2 people could do whatever they needed to do to, basically, the saying in Rome was always SPQR, Senate e Populesque Romana, or the Senate and people of Rome. They could do whatever they needed to do for the Senate and people of Rome, with the caveat that they had to agree on what they were doing. Sorry for the coughing fit, guys. The idea with this is that if we have 2 people who have to both agree that they're doing the right thing, we're going to avoid people coming out to be tyrants. The term dictator also comes from Rome. The term dictator meant that in times of great trouble, Rome could elect somebody to be, or the Roman Senate could elect somebody to have all the power of the Senate and council and everything without checks. It wasn't a term that was negative the way it is today. It kind of became negative pretty quickly because effectively when Caesar was made dictator, they thought it would just be for a short time. And he's like, nope, I'm good. I'm not giving it up, which is why he got stabbed by senators. So the presidency has checks and balances. They came up with the idea that one president serves a fixed term and executes federal law. The president may veto legislation. Congress may override it. The Senate participates in appointments and treaties. And the House may impeach and the Senate tries impeachment trials. So let's walk through some of these checks. And we have checks and balances throughout the entire legislative system. A lot of people think that the reason for the checks and balances is to break down government, to make it so that it's harder for them to act. Some argue on the flip side, and I'll let you guys kind of decide which one you think is more correct, is that the reason for the checks and balances was to require both sides to cooperate. So why, let's walk through these checks and balances. The first one, the president can veto legislation. If the president has to be the one to enact the legislation, it makes sense maybe that he has the ability to veto it. Congress can pass the laws. The president doesn't really get to write them, but he does get to, in some cases, veto them. The counter check to that, though, is that Congress can override a presidential veto. Second, the president doesn't serve forever. They can and have to leave office. Third, the president has the ability to appoint lots of different offices, like ambassadors, cabinet secretaries, but lots of times that says with the advice and consent of the Senate. This means that while the president can appoint somebody, the senators have to agree that that person should be doing that job. But then let's talk about the fun thing for everybody, impeachment. Impeachment is really interesting. It has come up a lot more recently, obviously, because I can't keep track if Donald Trump was impeached 2 or 3 times at this point. There are 2 pieces to this. Growing up, I always thought that impeachment meant that you're out of office. But it doesn't. If somebody is impeached, that is the House of Representatives basically making a determination that there's enough evidence to believe that this person has committed some sort of high crime or misdemeanor that makes them ineligible to be president. It's a probable cause determination. We do this all the time today. Does anybody know why we call the trial court in Missouri the circuit court? It comes back to 200 years ago when people used to ride horses around to get to the various courthouses. And what they would do is they would ride circuit. So a judge might have all these different towns that they were in charge of, and they'd go from place to place, and maybe they'd only be in a town once a month. They rode circuit. So if you wanted your neighbor's farm or their spouse or something like that, you could be like, hey, this guy, he killed Bob. And like most good town folk, you'd probably be arrested pretty quickly and put in jail, and you'd have to wait till the circuit judge showed up. Bob might not be dead. Bob might have just gone on vacation. As we started to find out that things like this occurred, we created the requirement that you have to find, before you can hold somebody for a crime, due process, or you have to find reasonable, probable cause, that's the right term. You have to find probable cause that a crime actually occurred. So now we have preliminary hearings. If you are arrested today in Cole County, within about a month, you're going to have a preliminary hearing where they're going to decide whether or not there's enough evidence to believe that a crime occurred. Or they can take your case to the grand jury where they're going to do the exact same thing. Only then do you proceed to the actual criminal portion of your case. It's the same thing when we talk about the presidency. The House of Representatives is going to make a determination that there's enough evidence to believe that this person committed a crime or misdemeanor. That's the way the term is written. But then the Senate is going to act like the trial court for that. The Senate is going to basically have an impeachment trial where they are going to get lots of evidence from different witnesses and stuff like that. And if they believe that this is true, they're going to kick that person out of office. If they believe it is false, or if they, find it's true but don't want to remove them from office, they will keep them in office. Impeachment is very difficult to do, especially when it comes to a president, and especially in modern times. So while people have been impeached several times, Bill Clinton and then Donald Trump, in my lifetime, no one's actually been removed from office. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about federalism next class, but for this class, I want you guys to know that the Constitution divided things among national and state authority. So at a national level, the national government has the ability to tax, the commerce regulation that we talked about, supremacy in the military and diplomacy. At the state level, they have various reserved rights. They have governing authority over their territory. They have state institutions and laws, participation in elections and amendments, and they have the ability to implement federal systems how they see fit within their territories. We've got to address this because slavery was a big component of what the Constitutional Convention discussed, and it was unfortunately embedded in the Compromise. Several of the people at the Constitutional Convention wanted to abolish slavery right then and there. But if they were to do that, then the states that had slaves probably wouldn't sign on to this thing that would destroy them economically. Second, on the flip side, we have this concept of how are we going to count people? How are we going to set it up so that southern states are going to be represented proportionally to northern states? They come up with this idea called the 3/5 Compromise. It increases the representation for slaveholding states without granting those people any political rights. So for the slaves that were in somewhere like Virginia, they were counted in terms of how many representatives Virginia got, but they didn't actually give those people any rights to vote or anything like that. Before 1808, and again, this was written into the Constitution, Congress could not prohibit the international slave trade. They created an expiration date on it, but they couldn't do anything until then. And the fugitive person provision required return of slaves across state lines. We talked about that. I'm going to skip the activity since you guys can't see it. All right, the last thing to note before I ask if you guys have any questions is that every single constitutional design choice that was made ended up becoming essentially a compromise. It distributed power, but it also had some costs associated with it. And we see that today, right? So even though we're talking about something that happened hundreds of years ago, now we are experiencing the problems with it. So for example, Donald Trump is the first Republican in like 8 elections to win the popular vote. Typically, when a Republican president has won the presidency, they've done so through the Electoral College. Fewer people voted for them overall, but because the way the math works out, they win because more electors vote for them. So we're still dealing with some of the compromises that were made today. People all the time talk about things like, let's get rid of the Electoral College. Should we? I don't know. That's something we can talk about later on. So we've gone through a lot of stuff today. What questions do you guys have, if anything? Perfect. Let me turn this off, then I'll take roll really fast.